Welcome to the ROONEY Report. Today we have with us Melissa Ohden. Melissa, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Melissa, I've interviewed hundreds of guests over the years, and I'm just looking forward to having you share your story. I read your book, and let's talk about initially when you first found out that you had survived an abortion. What were your feelings, and what were you thinking?
I was 14 when I found out my story, and so I think that kind of puts it in context for people from the very beginning, right?
Yeah.
14 is not an easy age for anyone.
Yeah.
If it is, I'd love to meet them, but it was not easy for me. And
Sure.
And so to be 14 and have my adoptive mother tell me that I survived a failed abortion, that kind of news was just absolutely devastating.
Why do you think she did that at that age?
It was an accident.
Oh, sure. Nothing intentional.
No. My older sister was actually facing an unplanned pregnancy.
Ah, yeah.
And so was not sure what decision she was going to make about that. And so our parents broke this secret, this silence that they had kept, and they told her my story, hoping that she would understand just how close abortion hit home in our lives.
Yeah.
So they told her my story, and like any good teenage sister, she didn't keep it a secret from me.
Sure. Yeah.
So in reality, there were just a lot of really kind of difficult things happening at the time. But I don't think there's ever a time that my parents would have pinpointed in my life and said, now would be a really good time to tell her that.
Right. Did it help your sister keep her child?
It did. She carried him, parented him, finished her high school diploma on time, went on and had other children, and he's an amazing man.
So for you, in retrospect, it worked out well, right? I mean, because you helped your sister.
Absolutely, and in the grand scheme of things, she helped me, and her son helped me. His existence was not an accident.
Right. So then, when did you start sharing your story publicly, and was that an extremely difficult, or was it more of a natural? That you felt called to do it?
Well, it's a little bit of both, I would say. Yeah. So, when I first found out my story, I spoke a little bit about it in my high school. That's funny for me because looking back on it now, people will still send me messages and say, I can remember this speech you gave, and I think it was like 8th grade. And they'll say, I remember how you left a seat empty to show the class what it would be like if that abortion had been successful. And so that stuck with them all these years later. But for me, I wasn't ever thinking, gosh, you know what, I'm going to share this story openly with the world. This is going to be my career. I had to go through this process of, grieving and healing and searching for my birth parents and searching for my medical records. And then, really for me, it was a matter of faith, following Christ and knowing that I was called to share his story, because it's not mine, it's his. And give up my career. I have a master's degree in social work. I really had to give up every last ounce of myself.
Right.
And even then, it was 2007 when I first started speaking publicly. I felt like, this is what I'm called to do. This is the right thing to do. But I wasn't ever thinking, you're going to testify before Congress, you're going to travel the world, you're going to be someone that other people see as a leader. That was not on my radar.
So you talked about when you first started telling your story, and I remember reading your book, and I'm like, wow. I don't know if it was the first time or one of the first times, and there's a priest in the back of the room. Can you share with us that?
Yeah, that was pretty early on in my speaking events. And so, back then, things were very raw for me, very emotional in the first place, because I was starting to learn more about my biological family and really just kind of learning how to share my story. And so, I would go into events kind of with a heightened emotion. And other people were also emotional. I mean, they still are, but back then, there was a really particular event in Iowa. So I grew up in Iowa, lived in Iowa for a very long time, and I was speaking at a pro-life event outside of the Sioux City community. And there were 2 men in the room, just full of emotion, kind of both like holding their head in their hands, sobbing. And I was waiting as the night went on to see if they would share with me what it was that had impacted them. And the younger man of the 2 got up and left that night before I could speak with him. But the older man stuck around. And before I could approach him, he actually went up on the stage that night to give the closing prayer.
Wow.
And that's when I saw the collar and realized that he was a priest. And he was able to share the story. He pointed out to our crowd and he said, "And who says that prayers go unanswered?"
Right.
And I was sitting in my seat thinking, it feels like he's talking to me. And he went on, and of course he was talking to me. He was able to share with our crowd that night that he had prayed outside of St. Luke's Hospital in Sioux City, Iowa, back in 1977, that someday a child's life would be spared from an abortion. Wow. And that's where I survived.
And you had no clue that he was in the audience, right?
Of course not, no. And then, of
so
course.
Did you break down and cry?
Oh, yes. We hugged one another that night and were crying. And, it was really beautiful because my adoptive mom was there and my husband and my oldest daughter was pretty young at the time, and even some extended family. And so they all kind of got to witness this beautiful moment. But, I think that's one of the things that I love most about what's happened in my life is that by sharing my story, all of those people who somehow played a part of it in some way, shape, or form have been able to now know that such good came from what was done. So I've met other people who prayed outside of that hospital. I mean, I do routinely. I've met nurses who, had been a part of abortions there before I survived. I've had communication with a nurse that was there when I survived, and actually even met one nurse and, two nurses from different hospitals who played a part in my life very early on. And I think that's one of those things people just don't talk about in our world, is that abortion impacts multiple people's lives.
And it was a nurse who saved your life, right?
Yeah, my adoptive parents had been told that there were 2 nurses who intervened to save my life. And, I've kind of lived my life thinking I may never know who they were. And I was given a little tiny glimpse of that about 3 years ago when my book, You Carried Me, came out. A nurse reached out to me, said, I've been following you for years on social media. She said, I read your book and I know now it's you, without a doubt, that I remembered from that hospital. And so she was working in the neonatal intensive care unit that day when a tall blonde nurse rushed me in. Because she was unwilling to just leave me there to die.
Well, thankfully, yes, And what's so unusual about your story, if I remember right, is that your grandmother was involved in the abortion.
Yeah, my maternal grandmother was a prominent nurse in Sioux City, oversaw a lot of the education for many of the nurses. She had a lot of experience on the OBGYN floor, we'll just put it that way. And so she was able to make a secret forced abortion take place. My birth mother was 19, college student, not married to my birth father. And that knowledge is what enabled her to force the abortion upon my birth mother. She didn't want to have an abortion. My birth parents would have married, parented me, but they were not given any choice. And I know people can look upon my circumstances, and I hear it often enough, where people will say, oh, well, that's really rare. Not as rare as what you would think. I hear the stories from women all the time who will say, you are the first person, you are the first person who I've ever heard speak publicly about coercion and force and the pressure, and it's usually at the hands of mothers and aunts and grandmothers and sisters.
Oh, sure.
Influential women in their lives.
So were you ever able to meet or reconcile with your grandmother? I can't recall.
Not with my grandmother. So my maternal grandmother is deceased. It's really interesting because God really placed us very close to one another. Back when I was in college, I didn't realize that I was attending college on the same campus that she was teaching at.
So you probably saw her and didn't even know it.
I mean, it was the same college campus that my birth mother became pregnant with me on. I know people can hear these parts and go, what? Yeah, really? It happened, and it's wild. But yeah, she passed away before we would ever have had any chance to communicate. But I suspect that she was probably told that I had reached out to the family. She was still alive when I had sent them a letter, but she has passed away. My grandfather's still alive, and I think the saddest part for me in all of this is to see how that abortion impacted their family. They chose to keep my survival a secret. I never could have imagined that my birth mother didn't know that I was alive. And that's what happened. She was told the abortion had been successful. I was placed for adoption without her consent.
Wow.
And then 30 some years later, she saw me on television, or actually another family member did, and they knew immediately who I was. And so they had to break down and tell her the truth, that I had survived all those years ago.
So how did your mother, how did she know it was you?
Well, a few things. There's, even though this happens more often than what people care to admit, the reality is when we've lost, 61 million lives in the United States alone, that we can put our finger on those numbers. The number of us that survive in comparison to that is very small. And then just the details, to know what hospital it was, the city, and I look exactly like my biological father. So they knew without a doubt that it was me.
So then you got the news that your mom wanted to meet you, right? So that had to be an undescribable feelings and emotions, and you accepted her invitation, and where did you meet?
Well, and I actually put out that invitation to her, so we communicated for about 3 years, really because we had to learn to build that trust and love with one another, and mainly I needed her to trust me because she was really not raised in a home with unconditional love the way that I was.
Right.
And so she really questioned that this could be real. And so she learned to trust me. And I think we all were ready to meet, but there was still kind of this apprehension of, what if I ask them and they say no? Then what? Then we're all rejected and wounded again. And so I was the one that contacted my half-sister about 3 years into our communication and said, hope this isn't awkward. You can say no, but I'm just curious if you'd be ready to meet. And the immediate response was, yes, we've been waiting for this. And so we met face to face for the first time at a very public place at the zoo. And I that may sound so strange to people, but in some respects, it's a little bit safer to meet in a public place, right? And we really strive to live somewhat normal lives, as normal as you can in the midst of this. And so we met at the Kansas City Zoo.
Wow, yeah. And it's been, from what I understand, very good for both of you, right?
Absolutely. It's not easy, right? There's no book out there that says, if a child survives an abortion and there's a secret kept, this is how you live this out, right? Maybe I'll write that book next. But, we love one another just fiercely. On the days where I am out doing things in the world, she is the one who is messaging me and saying, I'm proud of you, kiddo. I'm 42 years old, and she'll say, I'm proud of you, kiddo. And, she would be the first person to tell you that I'm the first person who ever fought for her.
Oh, wow.
And to me, that means the world. This is not how it should be. I'm grateful to be the one that fights for her, but she should have had parents that fought for her. She should have had extended family members who supported her.
And there should have been a law that would have protected her from being pressured, into that decision.
Absolutely. A lot of people failed her.
Melissa, my grandmother was an orphan, and so that's why I think I'm so pro-life, because I think if her mother, or my great-grandmother, lived in today's society, she could have easily been pressured like your mother was, and then I wouldn't be here. And what I really appreciate about you and other survivors, is Melody Olson, who we both know, is that when there's a pro-abortion politician, and there's a lot of them out there, any abortion survivor is just someone that it just causes, I wrote an article, I said cognitive dissonance.
Yes, those are the words that were just popping into my head.
Yeah, because they can't say at one moment that you're just a choice, and then they see you, it's like, well, you're not just a choice, you're a human being.
And I've begged that question even to members of Congress. You know, when we hear all this talk about women's rights, well, where were my rights? When they were poisoning and scalding me to death? And where were the rights of my biological mother who was forced to have that abortion? Where are the rights of the little girls that are losing their lives to abortion each and every day? I think they need to have a really honest conversation about what they mean by women's rights, because the women's rights they're talking about are not very inclusive.
Right, exactly, yeah. And what are the common, I mean, I just can't imagine a good argument, to favor late-term abortions or abortions, but I mean, what do you hear as their response when you tell them your story?
Yeah, sometimes the reactions are pretty interesting and, somewhat predictable, I guess, at this point. Years ago, they would say, oh, she must be lying. And then we'd say, hey, by the way, here are my medical records.
Yeah.
And here are, the admissions of my biological family and the medical professionals who cared for me. And so then they kind of quieted to that. Although we still see in the media and we hear from the pro-abortion lobby and politicians, abortion survivors don't exist, failed abortions don't happen, born alive legislation is not needed. But through my work with the Abortion Survivors Network, I've connected with 316 other abortion survivors, most from the United States. You're going to see more of their stories as time progresses, because the more this is being battled out publicly, the more other abortion survivors are saying, no, we are not going to allow you to keep saying we don't exist.
Exactly.
And now we know that other people exist. And I think that's probably the biggest dynamic is through our Abortion Survivors Network, they know they're not alone, and we're working on healing and we're working on social connections and, giving them tools to learn how to share their story. We've been silenced and shamed and marginalized. And so they will play that out sort of in the public square and in the media, but when they come face to face, what I typically find is people start to get kind of nervous and they go, I'm not talking about you. Oh, who are you talking about then?
Yeah.
Like that other abortion survivor, the one that you don't have to face?
Correct. Yeah.
Right? That's what it is. And so it's unfortunate that abortion survivors have to live our lives in such a public way in order to influence the world. But at this point, it looks like that's what we have to do.
Yeah.
Many of us. Not everybody will share their story publicly. But that's what I always try to educate people on too, is just because somebody doesn't share their story publicly doesn't mean they don't exist. I mean, since when did that become the criteria?
Yeah, I was talking at a church function with a woman who was saying, well, we should, and she said she's pro-life, and I'm not disagreeing that, about her beliefs, but she said, we should leave that decision to a woman. And then I said to her, have you ever met an abortion survivor? And she said, no. And I said, well, I think most women probably do make the right decision, but not all of them do. And then her response was silence, which I think you probably get that a lot, right? They
Uncomfortable silence, yes, on their part, not mine. I'm used to it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. What else can they say? And even here in Minnesota, there's abortion survivors, even back in, you said 2018. 2018.
So Minnesota is one of only a handful of states. 8 states report out or maybe we're at 9 now, that report out the numbers of children who survive failed abortions, which to me is very important because we keep hearing that message, right? This doesn't happen.
There should be more states doing that.
Yes, and that's part of what I'm going to push for. But Minnesota is one of the few that do. And in a 2018 report, and people can look it up, read it very easily, you had 3 children in Minnesota that survived in 2018 that were documented. None of them survived after they were born alive. One was listed as having a life-limiting condition. I think that is the verbiage that was used. Another one was given comfort care as planned. And
which means they leave them to die.
Correct.
Right? Yeah.
Correct. That's fancy wording for that. And then the other child, they said, was born prior to viability, essentially. And I don't trust that language either, to be perfectly honest, because I've seen and heard too much.
Yeah. Well, and at one of President Trump's State of the Unions, he had a 21-week
Yeah,
old
she's a Kansas City girl.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I just think here, again, this is in Minnesota, but you can go to Planned Parenthood and have an abortion up to 24 weeks. So that's beyond
well, and frankly,
viability.
even after that, right?
In Minnesota, yes. Yeah. Unfortunately, we had a court case called Doe versus Gomez, and there are no known plaintiffs in this court case. One of our attorneys for Life Legal did research, and any other court case, if there was no plaintiffs, what would they do? They'd throw it out, right? But sadly, and then they find in our Constitution, some, right that's not there. Just like with Roe v. Wade and Doe versus Bolton, it's not there, but it's.
And we're seeing that in many states. There are states that now are becoming the battleground. Iowa has had that battle going on. Kansas has had that battle going on, where somehow they find that there is a constitutional right to abortion. First of all, no. And secondly, I would find that incredibly hard to believe that when those states were founded,
right.
right?
Abortion was not legal. Yeah.
When you dissect the argument, it's pretty absurd.
Yeah. So one of the common objections that people say, and I have a ready response, but I'd like to hear yours. When people say, well, that's just one issue, there's a lot of other issues. I mean, you can give a better response than I can, but what do you say?
Well, this interview is my chance to be candid, right? I mean, I don't always get to be candid and off the cuff, but the reality is that without the right to life, there are no other rights. I mean, that is a very simple. And so, when people want to say, oh, Melissa, you're just a one-issue voter. Well, you know what? That one issue is the issue.
Yeah.
If I was not accidentally born alive, I never would have had the right to vote, right? I never would have had the opportunity to live my life, to be a mother, to be someone's wife, right? All of those things. And I think sometimes people are just so short-sighted when it comes to that argument. So we have to be unafraid to walk that out and say, listen, when you make that argument, you're forgetting that you were given a very foundational right.
Yeah. And most people, if you said, well, if you lived in Nazi Germany and you said, well, the concentration camps, those are just one issue,
Right.
I mean, how are you going to vote for that? Or slavery is just one issue. I mean, we all understand it. Or the gulags of Russia, and the tyranny of these places. To me, it seems so obvious to most people, but we are gaining a lot of ground, and thanks to your work and others, that people can't, just kind of tiptoe around the issue like had been happening for a number of years.
Yeah, it's long past time that we had a really honest conversation in our society. And yes, survivors are very much a part of that conversation.
Yeah, making a huge difference. Now, at the end of this program, we're going to show a brief clip. And you're the face of choice. And maybe share with us what was the inspiration? And I know you were a big part of that commercial.
Yeah, so someone had approached me many years ago and said, we should really do a Super Bowl commercial about survivors. And I was kind of going, yeah, that's a great idea, but no, long shot, $5 million. I mean, I can think of 10 things wrong with this idea, right?
Right.
But we said, after 2019 happened, maybe we really need to consider this, because we do have to face the choice.
Now, when you say after 2019 happened, for our viewers, why was that so important?
2019 introduced so much aggressive abortion legislation across the United States. So, a lot of people think of New York, but what they aren't thinking about are states like Illinois.
Yeah.
Where,
Virginia.
really, I mean, Virginia almost happened, but Illinois really happened. And we saw in many states where they were taking away the rights of abortion survivors.
Yeah.
And that's one of those things we just kind of want to pretend aren't happening, but they did. And so we really felt like it was time for people to face that choice. So we made an ad featuring 14 abortion survivors from around the world. And it was with, we call it our sister organization, Faces of Choice. And they're going to really be doing a lot of our media now, campaigns for abortion survivors. Good. And so, we encourage people to just face the choice that behind that word, every time people use that word, there is a human being behind the word choice.
Yes, yes. And your short piece is very good. You'll probably find this maybe a little humorous, but I've always told people I'm pro-choice because I think everybody should have a choice to live, and abortion is not pro-choice. That's a term that they came up with when they were afraid they were going to lose.
Oh yes, and that's why we've arrived at this place, right? Because they did such a successful job of getting to that point where it really has taken over the narrative of the nation. It's popular, it's hip, it's progressive, it's compassionate, and we know it's none of those things.
No, it's brutality, cruelty, and I think this Faces of Choice is just a great counter to being people who call themselves pro-choice but really support abortion on demand, and most people don't even know that in our country Roe v. Wade and Doe versus Bolton allows abortion all the way up until birth. Yeah. So unfortunately we're running out of time. Do you have a closing comment that you'd like to share with our viewers, or any thoughts?
No, I just encourage people to keep staying the course. It's not a time where we can be complacent, to leave it up to someone else to support women or men or children in a time of need. Each and every one of us are called to do something and can do something. So this isn't just something that Melissa needs to go do. This is something each and every one of us can do.
Yeah, everyone has the gift of life who's watching this program, and a purpose.
Yeah.
And I appreciate your gift of life and your purpose and all that you're doing, and I encourage anybody who's watching this to join you, and even little things can make a big difference.
Little things become big things. Absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
All right, thanks so much for joining us. We'll be back again next week with the ROONEY Report.
Can you look me in the eye?
Can you look me in the eye and tell me that I shouldn't exist?
That I should be dead?
That I deserve to die that day.
Can you look me in the eye and tell me that my very survival was a mistake?
A terrible toll on society?
Can you look me in the eye and tell me that in my most vulnerable state, I was nothing more than a parasite?
A collection of body parts. Subhuman?
Worthless?
In 1952, I survived multiple abortion attempts.
DNC abortion.
An instrument abortion.
DNC abortion.
Heritage abortion.
A vacuum aspiration.
abortion.
An induced
A
abortion.
saline infusion abortion that was meant to poison and scald me to death. I am the face of choice. I am that choice.
These are actual human beings who survived abortion procedures when they were still in their mother's wombs. These are the eyes, voices, and faces of choice. Choice is not merely a word. Choice is a person. Learn their stories.